Welcome, everyone. It's so good to see so many of you and lots of familiar faces. So welcome, everyone, to Charleston Jewish Book Fest and the first event of the fall semester hosted by the Pearlstine Lipov Center for Southern Jewish Culture. I'm Ashley Walters. I'm an assistant professor of Jewish studies here at the College of Charleston, as well as director of the Pearlstine Lipov Center for Southern Jewish Culture. I'm joined by my co-host, Kim Browdy, associate director of community relations in the Jewish studies program. So what I'd like to do is I will introduce our guest of honor in just a minute, but first I would like to explain how tonight's gathering is going to work. So the plan is for Dr. Liebman and me to begin by discussing her really remarkable book, one of many remarkable books that she has authored. After that, we will take questions from the audience. We kindly ask that you type questions in the chat box, which Kim and I will be monitoring throughout the talk. As we work our way through the questions, I invite you to unmute yourself and ask them. I'll call on you, and then you are free to ask them yourselves. Or if you'd prefer not to, you are more than welcome to just let me know, and I'm happy to read the question for you. So our goal is to try and get through as many questions as we can in 1 hour. Just to let you know, this session is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube in the next couple of days. So to help us avoid any unintended audio, we ask that you just double check that your microphone stays on mute. So we have many co-sponsors for tonight. And I think it really speaks to the widespread interest in Laura's work. So in addition to the Pearlstine Lipov Center for Southern Jewish Culture, I'd also like to thank the Yaschik Arnold Jewish Studies Program at the College of Charleston, the Charleston JCC Foundation, the African American Studies Program, the Department of Religious Studies, the Carolina Lowcountry and Atlantic World Program, the Department of History, and the Southern Studies Program, all of which are here at the College of Charleston. So now I'd like to say a bit about our guest that I'm so excited to have with us here tonight. Dr. Laura Arnold Liebman is a professor of English and Humanities at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. Her recent book, The Art of the Jewish Family, won 3 National Jewish Book Awards. She has been a visiting fellow at Oxford University, a Fulbright scholar at the University of Utrecht, the University of Panama, and the Bard Graduate Center. Her latest book, Once We Were Slaves, was released this summer and hit many of our mailboxes just last week. I have to admit, I was getting a little nervous there that it wouldn't make it to me in time. So this book will be the subject of our conversation tonight. So what I'd like to do is actually divert from the biography that Laura and I discussed ahead of time and just share a little bit about my own experience of working with Laura. I'll see if I can embarrass her a little bit. I'm not sure where Laura gets the time and energy to, beyond the wonderful books she writes, beyond the courses she teaches in her many public talks, but Laura has truly in every sense emerged as a leader in the field of Jewish studies. She puts tireless energy into mentoring junior scholars in the field, particularly those who are underrepresented by leading mentorship programs, summer writing workshops, book proposals, publishing workshops, not to mention the many other ways she provides service to the field. So just to give you a quick example, last year when much of our teaching was done over Zoom, I mentioned to a group of Jewish studies professors that I wanted to find new technologies to make my Zoom classroom more interactive for students. And without missing a beat, Laura, who I'd never met before, raised her hand and said, I'd be happy to walk you through some of the technologies I use. And she did. She gave me her time to just share her wisdom and experience in the classroom. And I know I've been so touched by Laura's generosity, of which I've been on the receiving end multiple times in just the 1 year that I've been teaching. I want to conclude by saying that I find Laura to be exceptionally meaningful to the field of Jewish history in another way. She's really firmly committed to diversifying the field of Jewish studies, that is moving away from standard narratives of Jewish history that have really dominated scholarship over the past 2 centuries. And you can tell this by reading her books, by listening to her speak, that she's constantly thinking about how she can complicate and thereby enrich our understanding of Jewish history and Jewish communities, both past and present. Whether it be through her work on underrepresented populations of Jews, that is Jews of color, women, poor Jews, and so forth. I think these individuals have so often eluded the archives, and it really takes a committed and innovative scholar to think of new ways to recover them. She's truly someone that walks the walk. It's present in her scholarship. It's present in her collaboration with fellow scholars, both inside and outside of Jewish studies. And I think it's present in her mentorship and service to the future of a more robust field of study. So we cannot possibly take the intervention she has put forth in this book, this wonderful book that we're going to discuss tonight. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Laura.
Thank you so much for that super touching introduction. And thank you everybody for taking the time tonight to come out through Zoom and get together with us and have this conversation.
All right, so I think it's time to just dive in. So I think a great place to begin is to just ask you, how and why did you come to write this book?
Yeah, great question. That in spite of the fact that I had 2 books come out right in a row, I think of myself as a really slow writer and researcher. So this is definitely a book that's been taking a couple of years to write. And I think in some ways grows out of a lot of earlier research that I was doing for other books and sort of feeling stymied by the inability to represent certain aspects of Jewish life in the earlier period. And so that sort of slow returning time and time again to archives. I would say also, maybe I'll share screen for a second and show some pictures too, since I don't know if people know this, but I'm definitely a material culture person. So whenever I can show you a picture, I'm always thrilled to show you a picture. So one of the things I would say also that really sort of got this project going, let's see if I can get it to go forward for you, are these 2 little ivory miniatures. And at the time when I was looking at miniatures, I really at first only knew about the one of Isaac, the one on the left. And I had been talking with a friend who worked in Barbados, and he had mentioned finding out something about him in the archives. And I tucked it away because I was like, oh, that's that super charming sort of Darcy looking person from the miniatures that I adore. So definitely I would say there's a way in which the objects themselves led then to wanting to pursue and find out more about who these people were, as opposed to like starting with the person and then looking for objects about them.
So could you, most people, because the book is just now hitting bookshelves, most people probably haven't had a chance to read the book. Could you tell us a bit about them and also just more broadly what this book is about?
Yeah, sure. So Sarah Brandon Moses and Isaac Lopez Brandon were born at the end of the 18th century in Bridgetown, Barbados. And they were born not into a Sephardic family, as their last names might suggest, but they were born enslaved to the Lopez family in Bridgetown. But their father, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, was one of the wealthiest Jews on the island at the time. And over the course of their lives, they go from being poor and Christian and enslaved to being some of the wealthiest Jews in New York before Sarah dies right around the age of 30. So she's got this incredibly short life, but a really vibrant one, where she moves around the Atlantic world with her brother. They go to Suriname, where they convert to Judaism. She goes to London, where she goes to this elite boarding school. He gets involved in the Jewish civil rights movement in Bridgetown, Barbados. And then they eventually end up, in large part because she marries a Jew from New York and Philadelphia, where they get reclassified racially as white. And so in the book, I'm really interested in this story of what it means to be traveling around the Atlantic world and how race is really understood differently in each of the places that they live. So I think in the past, a lot of times people tell stories about racial shift or racial change as being about passing, where somebody like pretends to be a different race. And that really is not an option for either of these two people. Every single place they live, there's members of the Barbadian Jewish community that knows they began their life enslaved. It's really much more a story about how race is understood differently in different parts of the Atlantic world. So that's sort of the book in a nutshell. And then at the end of the book, I look to see what happens to their descendants, particularly their children, who also end up going on these amazing journeys around the world, ending up in Canton in China, involved in textile trade. A couple of Sarah's sons end up in Nicaragua trying to overthrow a government. They're very involved in sort of big events in the 19th century.
So I do want to hone in on a lot of the different points you just made. As you can tell, this is a book with a lot of layers to it, and I want to make sure we get to each of those. But I am really struck by the breadth of time and places that you cover in this book. It's I think in a sense dizzying, from Barbados to Suriname to London to Philadelphia to New York City to major centers of industry in China. So I'm curious, could you tell us a bit about your research project and, maybe if you have any good war stories to share from the archives?
Sure. Yeah, so that's where I think, for me, in some ways, that movement around the Atlantic world makes their story not unusual, but representative of Jews during this time period. And so in some ways, I was really excited about their story because it allowed me to talk about each of the major places where Jews settled around the Atlantic world, and to really think about how there was regional variation between the different places where Jews lived. So for me, that was ideal. I will say this is the kind of book that I couldn't have written 10 years ago, even if I wanted to. And I did want to write it 10 years ago. Like, it's so funny looking back in time. And I was like, this is the book that I want to write. I was like, oh my gosh, I knew almost nothing about them. How did I think I was going to write that book? But it really helped that in between a book that I had written on messianism that looks at the Jewish Atlantic world, that I was able to go back to archives across 3 different continents to look for the little places that they had left scraps of their history behind. So I do really think of this as like, you have a life, and each time they move, they kind of leave fragments of their story behind. And sometimes those archives also get displaced too. So some of what was left behind in Suriname when they converted makes its way to the Netherlands after the independence and is now in the Netherlands. Same thing with Barbados. Half the Barbados archives are in Barbados, some are in London. So it really was definitely one of those things where I sort of am cognizant of the privilege of being able to go to multiple archives and also to have a length of time to work on a project, right? That to be able to kind of, every time I went to an archive, look for little scraps of, I was supposed to be working on something else, and I looked for little scraps of what can I find on these two and what was going on with them. So that definitely was helpful. And also I would say just like grateful that that I started this project a while ago, because I can't imagine having tried to do that research during COVID. It would have been hard. Mm-hmm. You were asking for war stories. You want a kind of war story of like, I don't know how much people know about what happened. Let me go for it a little bit. One of the more interesting, it's not wanting to go for it. It's doing the rainbow of death. Oh, okay. No, it's thinking about it. I'm going to go forward through things. Oh, so here, this is probably one of my most favorite archives to visit, but one of the hardest to get to, other than maybe the ones in Suriname. And it's the National Archives in Barbados, and it's on the Cave Hill campus just outside of Bridgetown. And this area, let's see if I can show you on get my cursor over there. No, my cursor's like lost somewhere. Okay, the cursor's lost. But in the sort of middle building there is the place where you would go and look at the records, and the building off to the side is where a lot of the documents were kept, and you can see some sort of leaves hanging over the front, and there is this incredible mango tree in the front area. And the people who work there are fantastic and lovely, but there are a lot of rules about using this archive that were not like what I was used to in many other places. And for example, you aren't allowed to take photographs of any of the items. So everything, and you can't make Xeroxes, and they won't make them for you. So everything you look at, you have to transcribe quickly. And hope that you got it right. So sometimes I would transcribe it one year and I was frantic, and I'd go back a couple years later and I'd be like, you know what, I'm gonna look at that document again. I'd be like, oh, now I know what that says, that spot where I couldn't figure it out. So definitely one of those things where it took so much time just to get little pieces, because you're sort of like, oh, please just let me photograph it. It would be so much easier. I could go in and zoom in later, as I love to do with most things or have leisure time at home. But yeah, beautiful location, very slow work.
Yeah, as I was looking at some of the photos, the images in your book, I was thinking, maybe I didn't make the right choice on the history I chose to study. Very key. Lots of students in the audience. Think wisely about where you want to spend your time doing research, and then pick a topic. So I do want to.
So Ashley, I'll interrupt you for a second. It's funny that you say that, because my parents are scholars. They're scientists, and one of my parents works. My father works in places that are a little bit more boring. And my stepfather works in like awesome places.
Yeah.
And at some point, like I was like, "What's up with that?" And he's like, "Well, I have a choice. Choose wisely." And so I was like, "Note to self: choose wisely where you want to do your research." So yeah.
Yeah, always a good idea to think ahead about where you want to spend all that time when you're not in the archives.
Yeah.
So I want to dive into some of the themes of your book. And before I do, I should just say that as questions come to mind for our audience, please put them in the chat, and I'll be sure to start lining them up for our Q&A session. I do want to dive into some of these themes. One of the things that really strikes me about this book is the immense wealth and power that a lot of the key players in this family occupy in the Jewish community. And this is juxtaposed with the extreme poverty and powerlessness that a lot of people also have. And I think in your book, we really begin to see how Jewish families, and children in particular, come to occupy a really important role in bids for status and wealth, and perhaps the preservation of that status and wealth. And so I'm curious to hear more about the conclusions you drew in your study of this really fascinating, very large, very complicated family.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, actually, that, there's this wonderful quote by Jonathan Israel about during this time period, Jews are both agents and victims of empire. And I kind of hold on to that, because I think for any one of the particular people, there may be moments where they seem like all one thing, but then there'll be another moment where it sort of flips and they're the other side. Mm-hmm. And I would say even the father of the family, who is this incredibly wealthy slave owner, he comes to the colonies to escape the Inquisition, and you sort of wish that he would have brought some sense of the ethics of not imprisoning people with him, but he doesn't, right? So, but he does at various points, is very interested in making sure that his children are able to bring forward his legacy. So he, for example, not only pays to have them manumitted, so they are not born enslaved to him, they're born enslaved to a family that he's friends with, and he makes sure that they get freed both from the enslavers, and also pays money to the government to make sure that they will be free forever. And in addition, he pays so that she can go to this elite boarding school in London, and then puts down a 10,000 pound dowry so that she's able to marry somebody sort of very high society. So he really does seem to be concerned about making sure that she's able to be his future. At this point, he doesn't have any children, other Jewish children other than Sarah and Isaac, and he really wants to make sure that that lineage goes forward. And she does name one of her children after him, as does his son. So there is a way in which dowries, I think we often think of them as like, oh, it must mean that the woman has to pay off a man or something like that to marry her. But I think it's more helpful to think of it as the the fathers in the family put down a heavy dowry when they want to have their lines carried forward by their female offspring. So we really see that quite heavily in this family, that he, at various points, um, is very interested in securing their future and, for example, does donations to synagogues to when they move to new places to make sure that they'll kind of be received well. He's very careful about setting the stage for them as they
Mhm.
go forward in their lives.
Yeah. And we were talking elsewhere about these dowries and the enormous size of them. I was talking about how I was so glad in the book that you took the time to translate what 10,000 pounds ultimately means in, um, you know, what we would think of it as today. And it amounts to enormous sums of money, millions and millions of dollars. And it really opens your eyes and makes you think about the what is going on here, and ultimately how these individuals are being set up for the future. Um, I One of the things that strikes me is we see how the father figure, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, um, ultimately claims his children and begins to set them up for life. But we also see these women who have much less power also make choices to try and set their children up for the future. Could you talk a little bit about the moves these women are making as well?
Yeah, I think that's so important that, even the relationship between Abraham Rodriguez Brandon and Sarah and Isaac's mother, Sarah Esther Lopez, it's very hard to know to what extent that was a shared interest in each other. That very rarely were those kinds of relationships at the instigation of the woman. Usually the women don't have much choice in it. And even after she's free, she decides to stay with him. But is that because she wants to make sure that her children are going to be able to be as successful as possible? So I do feel like we can sort of see her in the background making sacrifices for her children's future, regardless of how she feels about Abraham. So there's that aspect of it. But even early on, that when Sarah's born, she takes her to the Anglican church and has her baptized, which I think is a really important moment in terms of she doesn't know and she has no control over whether Sarah could become Jewish. She That's not an option that she has agency over.
Mhm.
But by registering her with the Anglican Church, she does ensure that someday Sarah could have a legal marriage that she's been denied. And we see this consistently across her life, that Abraham refuses to marry her, even when he could and when it would improve the family circumstances
Mhm.
for everybody except for him. So it is, we do see her making these movements. And for me, one of the most interesting things, and this sort of gets back to that Bridgetown archive that I was looking at, one of the really helpful things that I found in that archive was being able to trace back her family and find out at least 4 generations back of people enslaved by this one Lopez family and what had happened to them, and to really think about um, how the mother's family plays such a big role in the children's lives. So, for example, one of their aunts through their mother's side is one of the first national heroes of Barbados and is known for her work as a Methodist for ensuring civil rights for both enslaved and free people of color. So there's this really strong history of social activism on their mother's side, that's just not represented in the Jewish records, but is really important backdrop for what's going on for them on the island.
Yeah, and I do want to get to the topic of religion and rebellion in a little bit. Um, One thing you mentioned that's coming to mind when you first introduced the book is you talked about how much of your work uh, in this book, to some extent, but in your other publications in particular, is based upon material history. And you can really see how your work in material history has rounded out the story when so much of the story is informed by these fragments, and there's not always a lot to work with. And since we have an audience of so many students, would you mind explaining what material history is and how it
Yeah.
has helped inform your story?
Yeah, so material culture are objects of everyday life. So they could be things like this lovely cup that I'm using that's you can see my lipstick on it, but that's a little pug cup that I have pugs, that my cousin gave me. So that would be an example of material culture, or it could be something fancier. It could be a Torah mantle or something like that. So like to think of a range of kinds of objects of everyday life, some of which are clearly explicitly religious, such as the Torah mantle, and some of which are not. And early on in my career, one of the things that was pretty important about using material culture, particularly gravestones, was that it allowed me to see that wide swaths of the Jewish community that weren't being um, necessarily listed in the community records or weren't being represented in the same ways because almost everybody had a gravestone associated with them. Occasionally in some cemeteries, graves would sink, and so you wouldn't have access to them. But you get a much wider sense, much more information about women, much more information about children, and in some circumstances, more information about Jews of color, depending on the cemetery. So really access to material culture allows you often to tell different kinds of stories than you would if you had to rely on what's in the archive. And I obviously what's in the archive is super important, but at the same time, anything that makes its way into the archive relies on, if it's a written text, somebody had to write it. So if you're looking at people who don't have access to education or don't have money or don't have paper or don't have any of the things that they need to produce documents, that's a problem. And then let's say they actually did write something. Now I'm reliant on somebody keeping it and then somebody donating it to an archive and the archive thinking it's worth keeping, right? So there's all these moments where things can kind of fall out of the archive's ability to have access to them, such that we lose voices from different people in a community. So really, I tend to be interested in objects that allow me to get some access to people who I wouldn't necessarily have been able to tell their stories otherwise.
Yeah. And I think some of your descriptions of material culture are some of the most vibrant and interesting parts of the book. I have to admit, I might be confusing your books here, but you have a description of a chair that's donated
Yes,
to
yeah.
the synagogue in Philadelphia, and just like you have these pages dedicated to just reading this chair, what it means, and how it demonstrates that the person who donated it didn't quite know his the audience who was going to be receiving the chair, and that ultimately proved to be detrimental to him.
Yeah, I love that chair. So that chair, in fact, there was many more pages on that chair that got cut out because it turns out people have limited interest in chairs eventually. But yeah, so the person who donated the chair is actually the son of Sarah and Isaac's enslaver, and he makes his way to New York and to Philadelphia before they do, and he's part of the reason why I was pointing out that they don't have any chance of like hiding their past. His children are going to school with Sarah's future husband. So like her husband's grown up with the people who had enslaved her before they met. So there is this way in which that chair for me is so it's if you go and visit the synagogue, you'll see it in the hall. And he's got this name that's kind of like John Smith of early Sephardic history. When anybody's named Moses Lopez, you're like, oh no, because there's 50 of them in every community. So it was such a charm to be able to figure out which one he was and why he was important and what was going on with the chair.
So we have questions starting to come in, and we actually have a a friend from grad school who's now a professor at Tulane, Ilana Horowitz, who is taking the line of questions in the next direction I wanted to go in. So Ilana is actually going to ask the next question.
Great.
Ilana, are you able to take yourself off mute?
If not, I can see it and read what she wrote.
Kim, can you unmute Ilana? Kim.
Okay, I'll just read her question.
Okay,
and
great.
You can jump in
Ilana,
if
can you wave so we all know who you are?
Oh, I was to say I'm waving, but no, Ilana. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. So Ilana's question was, I would love to hear more about how the character's experience with race changed between contexts. That's such a great question, because one of the things I really want people to get out of this book is a sort of concrete understanding of what we mean when we say race is a social construction. So I think I'm very much interested in, not that they have this race, but that their experience with race and the way they're racialized changes as they go from place to place. So one of the most, I guess a couple interesting examples of this happen mainly surrounding Isaac. So when Isaac comes to New York, in part because of his own wedding and because of his sister's wedding, he gets racialized as being white, and that allows him to have privileges that, as an immigrant who had been racialized as a person of color, he wouldn't have had during that time period. So members of his in-laws stand up when he goes to ask for citizenship, and he's able to become a voting member of the United States in ways that technically he probably shouldn't have at the time. So he definitely is starting to experience some of those privileges associated with whiteness when he comes into New York. However, he also sort of stops living in New York and goes back to Barbados for a while. And when he goes back to Barbados, he ceases to be white and becomes a person of color again, and then comes back to New York and it gets reclassified as white. So I think really helpful to see that sort of movement of civil rights happening, changing. And he had come to New York in part because he had early on been part of a bid for civil rights for Jews in Barbados. And the Jews who didn't want Jews to have civil rights, which sounds strange to us, but basically because you needed enough money to vote, the people who don't have enough money are like, please don't give us the vote. It's just going to make the people who are wealthy even less tolerable. And they keep on throwing out all these reasons to the Anglican Assembly why they shouldn't be allowed to, Jews shouldn't be allowed to vote. And they're like, Jews, can you trust them? You're like, what? What are you saying? Like, why would you make that argument? And the Anglicans are like, we aren't prejudiced in the way you think. So eventually, the reason that they come up with to the Anglicans for not allowing the Jews to vote is they point out that Isaac Lopez Brandon, who is a gentleman of color, would be allowed to vote, and people of color are not allowed to vote on the island at the time. And so that makes the Anglicans take notice. So the Anglicans tell the Jewish community they could be allowed to be a vestry, which would be the sort of stepping stone towards voting, if they disbar Isaac and make him no longer a voting member of the congregation. So there we sort of see this moment where really this quest for civil rights is being tied up with these questions of race all the time, in terms of it, because he's being racialized. Once that question comes up with the Anglicans, then his civil rights get demoted in the congregation, and that eventually gets a huge conflict, and he ends up deciding to come to the United States instead. And certainly there's plenty of racism in early New York and Philadelphia, some of which I talk about in the book. So it's not like somehow he's like leaving the Caribbean and coming to like the land of opportunity, but more that the way that race is being defined in each of those places allows somebody who's racially ambiguous and wealthy different opportunities than he was able to have in Barbados, at least.
Ilana gives you a thumbs up. So building off of that, I think one of the really striking things about the book is you demonstrate just how fluid race is within the world in which people like Sarah and Isaac are moving around in within these different contexts. And it's very different than the black-white binary that we tend to think of, thanks to kind of the reification of ideas of race in the 20th century. And so I think one of your major interventions is to just show how different it was for people during this time, and the possibility, if one is strategic and has the right resources, to potentially move around more than they would have been able to in other contexts. You had mentioned earlier that you don't really see Isaac and Sarah as passing. In the book, you refer to it more as a kind of code switching that's taking place. They kind of learn to read the different worlds and whatnot. And I'm wondering, what kind of resources help them to do this? How are they code switching? And, what options do they have?
Yeah, I do. That's a great question. That one of the things that was really interesting to me about thinking about the time that Sarah is spending in London at this elite Sephardic boarding school is the ways in which the Sephardic boarding school is training her to no longer think of herself as a servant or behave like a servant, and instead to behave like somebody who would command servants. So definitely there's a lot of different aspects of education other than just learning how to read and write, though those are certainly key, but also learning how to give charity. And this sort of gets back to our thing about the Father giving charity strategically to different congregations in order to smooth their way. But who is able to sort of give largesse to other people and who's supposed to be receiving it also positions her differently in different societies. So I think there's a really important way in which I'm constantly juggling in the book the fact that I want to think about them, not just them, but the other Jews who are either multiracial, Jews of color in the different places that they live. What sets them apart from the larger community, and in what ways that they're parallel? And their wealth makes them very unusual. So they just have all these opportunities, and the fact that they're racially ambiguous gives them opportunities that people wouldn't necessarily have had, not every person would have had. And even going back to their childhood, just it's so unusual that they get manumitted and that their father recognizes them and gives them money. Like, those things really are just moments that change their lives, regardless of some of the other things that he does during their lifetime.
So I'm curious, do you think that existing within a very unique community like the Jewish community provided a kind of space or buffer in which their ambiguity didn't matter quite as much? Because you note that as they're joining these prominent elite congregations in Philadelphia and in New York, that they're sitting alongside other multiracial Jews whose background is essentially known, it's public knowledge. And so I'm wondering if the fact that this is a reality for this very international community, where many of these Jews arriving in the late 18th, early 19th century are coming from the Caribbean and have, similar backgrounds, if this is kind of providing a space that provides a buffer for them that maybe wouldn't exist in the rest of in Christian society at this time. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. I'm not sure.
No, it's a really interesting question. I would say there's a way in which being Sephardic matters. So the fact that when they go to Suriname, Suriname actually is unusual in that very early on it has both an Ashkenazi and a Sephardic congregation. And the Sephardic congregation, as in most places in the colonies, is the classy congregation. And just as the congregations, both the Sephardic and Ashkenazi, demote in Suriname people with African ancestry to being second-class Jews if they're deemed people of color, according to Suriname's racial laws, which are not uncomplicated. just like they're demoting those people, the Sephardic congregation, if you married an Ashkenazi Jew, you could also get demoted to being a second class citizen. And would also lose your ability to get called up to the Torah and lose your ability to be sitting in the good seats in the synagogue, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a way in which their father's lineage as a member of the Nassau, a member of the Portuguese Jewish nation, really gives them a cachet within the Jewish community that trumps many other sorts of things. And we see this when Sarah comes to London because she gets married at the Portuguese synagogue, and her husband, who's from New York, is an Ashkenazi Jew. So in the eyes of that congregation, they're really clear in how they mark it in her ketubah. She and her father are members of the Nassau. They're members of the Portuguese nation, and for the London community, that's much more important than issues of African ancestry. That's what allows you to be a high class Jew. So, and even if she had wanted to marry Joshua maybe 15 years earlier at that congregation, she probably wouldn't have been allowed to, not because she's not good enough, but because he's not good enough. So I think that's really important to like get at the nuances of the ways in which her becoming Nassau, becoming a Portuguese Jew, is a really crucial part of the story. So if her father had been Ashkenazi, this would have been a really different kind of story that would have played out.
Yeah. We have a question from one of our students, and unfortunately Kim's having trouble with Zoom, so I think there's no chance of unmuting anyone. I'm so sorry. But one of our students, Zach Kronsberg, asked about the civil rights work that Isaac did. And you mentioned some of it when you were answering Alana's question, but I'm curious if you could kind of finish the story for us about what ultimately happens with Isaac's work. And, you know, does he actually manage to achieve what he was fighting for?
Yeah, so thank you to the student for the question. It's a really good one. That this is there's something interesting about this story, in part because it overlaps with this moment where not in all places do Jews have the ability to be part of government or be able to vote. And in particularly in the Caribbean, as well as in London or Amsterdam, Jews would not have had full civil rights during this time period. So in Barbados, where he's from, in order to be either a voting person or somebody who's elected to office at 18, 19 to 20, when he's starting his agitation for rights, you would not only need to be male, you would not only need to be white, you would need to have enough money that you qualified to be a voting person, and you had to be a member of a vestry. And a vestry turns out to be the specific kind of congregation that only the Anglicans have. So Isaac and his father and a group of the other wealthy Jews on the island say, I have an idea. Instead of converting to Anglicanism, we could just ask for the synagogue to become a vestry, which is what they do. So they petition the Anglican government to rename the congregation, the Jewish congregation, a vestry. And that's what then invokes this incredible debate. So the Jews who don't want it to become a vestry are the people who don't have enough money, by and large, that they would be allowed to vote anyway. And the other sort of thing lurking in the background is, if they're a vestry, the wealthy Jews are going to be able to collect taxes from the middling Jews a little bit better. So they're like, I don't even want to be part of this congregation, and now you're going to tax me and I'm going to have to pay? Like, please don't make us a vestry. So this big fight is going on in the newspapers and in the government of people petitioning and counter petitions and attempts to try and keep the Jews from getting the vote by the sort of middling Jews. So the end result of it is that the middling Jews, who have the most to lose in some sense in terms of power, finally sort of out Isaac to the Anglican government. And as a result, the Anglicans tell the Jewish congregation, if they want to be allowed to be a vestry, which would allow them to vote, they need to make Isaac no longer a full member of the congregation. So something similar to what would have happened if he'd stayed in Suriname. And there's a lot of fighting, and they eventually do this. And then Isaac leaves, that he clearly is fed up with them and takes off and goes to Philadelphia. But it is this moment where they've sort of discovered a loophole for how to get civil rights on the island. And Isaac probably it's hard to know whether Isaac did it of like, here's a way that I could be the first person of color who could vote on the island. Who knows? Or whether he just thought it was a good idea, right? To allow Jews to be part of the larger voting public. So, but it ends up turning out very poorly for him. And I'm sure it's very clear from the synagogue records that his father is devastated by the way that Isaac's being treated by the Jewish community. So.
But then ultimately he has more of a kind of happy ending.
Yes,
he goes on his merry way. So
yes. Then he again. This is part of like that incredible ability to be mobile. That's in part because he's good at business, in part because his father gives him a leg up in business, and he goes on to New York and to Philadelphia, and in New York he becomes a voting member of that congregation. In spite of the fact that there's like one of the people who's voting to decide whether he should become a full member is super racist at the time. So I'm always like, and what did that person say? And apparently he said nothing. So it's like fascinating, like why it gives you a sense that for that person, apparently, like in London, being a member of the Nassau trumps everything else, right? So very interesting that Jews seem to be sort of struggling with this idea of, does Jewishness trump everything, or are they sort of playing by local race rules?
Yeah. One of the paradoxes of the book is that many of the people who were born enslaved themselves, once they earn their freedom, they ultimately end up in having other enslaved people within their possession. And you note this happens in Barbados. I think it happens in Suriname. And then also in New York at this time, it's still possible to have enslaved people working within homes. And so Sarah and Isaac are ultimately confronted with, this position where they themselves were born enslaved, but are now free and living a very, very comfortable, good life. And I'm curious, what the proximity of this means to them. You had mentioned that the patriarch of the family had essentially escaped the Inquisition and unfortunately didn't carry some of the ethical lessons from that. And I'm curious if you find that's the same thing for Sarah and Isaac or other Jews of multiracial backgrounds who are experiencing this.
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting, so Sarah and Isaac's mother, and maybe just to loop back, I'm noticing some people are asking background about their mother, so I'll get to that in a second. But when her father dies, her father is a white Anglican man. Her mother, Sarah and Isaac's grandmother, is also a multiracial woman who's enslaved to the Lopez family, as is their great grandmother. So when their mother's father dies, he leaves them a house, and he leaves their mother a bunch of enslaved people. And it takes a while for people in the family, certain members of the family. So the woman I'd mentioned who became a Methodist, she ends up not deciding at some point she doesn't want to have enslaved people, but she doesn't free them. She sells the people that are enslaved to her. So it's a sort of thing of like, she decides she doesn't want to have slaves, but not that she wants to lose all the money from them either. So you see these kind of weird paradoxes going on. I would say that next generation of Sarah and Isaac, the only person I know that they had enslaved to them early on is their own great grandmother. So their enslaver leaves her to them. And I take that not to be a sign that then they're going to put their great grandmother to work, but it's really a way of them being able to keep her safe in her old age. It's very not atypical in Bridgetown that free people of color might own their own relatives, not because they're forcing them to work for them, but because it's so expensive to free people legally that it's sort of a loophole of being able to make sure that they're safe and not being enslaved to anybody else. Mm-hmm. And yet, even if you don't have enough money to legally free them. So I feel like there's different levels at which slavery sort of functions in the family. I don't want to, like, again, make a claim that somehow they're all completely immune to some of the social pressures around them. I think that's one of the things that makes the story um, poignant in some ways, is these various points where particularly white people that they interact with are constantly sort of making them confront issues about slavery by willing them people in their wills and whatnot. So I'm going to come back. I'm noticing in the chat that people are sort of asking, what's the story with the mother's line? So their mother is enslaved woman of color, that she's multiracial, as is their grandmother and their great grandmother, are all considered people who are of mixed African and white descent. And I wasn't able to trace back more than four generations, which is kind of miraculous even to have been able to do that. But so they have some African ancestry coming from their mother's side of the family. And their mother, somebody had asked, was their mother enslaved to their father? And the answer is no. She's a friend. She's enslaved to some of his friends. So his children are not born enslaved to him, and he has to go and pay the widow that owns them to free them. And then he also has to pay those huge manumission fees to the government in order to make sure that they're completely free and can never be, like, if he dies, that nobody's going to put them back into slavery.
So Dale Rosengarten asked, was it a love match?
Dale, do you mean between their parents, or who do you mean? Which people? Maybe you can type it in the chat since we can't hear from you.
Sadly, I don't think I can take people off mute.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, the parents. So we don't know. And I think this is one of the things that is very tricky to talk about, that and I think this sort of gets back to issues of agency. I do sort of talk a fair amount about the ways in which women of color who are enslaved in Bridgetown tend to be oppressed by their female owners and tend to have very little control over their sexual lives and their bodies. And I have a hard time imagining that that was not also the case for their mother as well. So she is very young when she first has her first child with Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. It's very hard to imagine that as being a relationship without some kinds of coercion in it, though we don't know from either way. She does stay with him all the way up until her death. And when she comes to New York, she's going by Mrs. Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, even though they don't ever officially marry. So, and he seems to let her do that in terms of the legal documents. So he clearly has a fair amount of respect for her. It's something he doesn't allow other women that he has relationships with to do. But again, I think it's important that even after she's free, to what extent is that because she stays with him because she loves him, or is she staying with him because he is so wealthy and her children's opportunities are so different with his support than they would be otherwise? So very hard to know. I think love is one of the hardest things to sort of find evidence of in the past, particularly if people don't leave diaries or letters. So.
I'm mindful of the time, and so because we're coming up on the end of our time together, I am going to just ask one final question of you, and that is related to the epilogue. I'm really struck by the epilogue in this book. I had mentioned to you that we had Bruce Haynes, author of The Soul of Judaism, here in the spring in April, and he talked about many issues that Jews of color face within the Jewish community today. And so in reading your epilogue, I was so struck that you dedicated the book to not only the descendants of the family, but Jews of color. And in doing so, you issue a really eloquent plea for inclusion, both in scholarship as well as the Jewish community today. And so I would love to hear you just kind of conclude by talking about how we might learn lessons from your book about Jews living in the late 18th and 19th century that are applicable to our world today.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. definitely, um, I do feel like all the moments where we do find records of how painful some of the interactions were within the synagogues, or moments of where people made them feel welcome. Like those are really important moments to take note of. And I mentioned an example that came from Sheriff Israel of a German visitor meets some women who are from Suriname who are in the congregation and sort of starts interrogating them like, who are you? What are you doing here? Assuming they don't belong because they look like they're also of partial African ancestry. And one can only imagine how horribly painful that was for the women to like have this sort of visible and verbal reminder of like lack of belonging. So I do think there are ways in which sometimes like seeing it in action someplace else can help us to think about what does it mean to think about inclusion, and also how does the very like way that we focus our scholarship and who counts in the past as being a Jew of interest um, also really um, sends messages to people unintentionally or intentionally about who counts as a Jew today, who's obviously a member of the Jewish community and who's not. So I do feel like there's something really important about not not just this book, but other books like Aviva Ben-Ur's that really are getting at the diversity of Jews in early America in terms of reminding us that this is an important part of American Jewish history, and that the story of the diversity of the Jewish community is not new. We need to widen our lens of how we're looking at the past and really think about how our own biases sometimes keep us from seeing some of the diversity that was happening on the ground. So.
Wonderful. Well, Laura, thank you so much. It's really been an inspiring conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us tonight. For those of you in the audience, if you'd like to hear more from Laura, you are in luck because she will be delivering the Janice Rothschild Bloomberg Lecture Series, the keynote lecture tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And this is part of the Southern Jewish History Conference that began today. It's co-hosted by the Southern Jewish Historical Society and the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina. You can register for the event, which is ongoing. Laura's talk is tomorrow, and we have panels again on Saturday. The conference is free, it's fully virtual, and it's open to the public. Unfortunately, I don't think Kim can share a link with you right now, so I will find a way to get links to those of you who are interested. Also, we have many, many more exciting events yet to come this semester. Some are being offered hybrid and others are virtual, so if you'd like to check out our list of events, you can head on over to the College of Charleston Jewish Studies website, and we have a calendar there for you. All right. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Laura.
Thank you so much. I hope people would come tomorrow. I'm super excited to share the work that I've been doing on Jewish women in quilts in the South. So I'm hoping people will be excited by all the great pictures that I have to share tomorrow and information about Jewish women. So
thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah.